So the situation we find ourselves in today is, instead of the world being a safer place after going through this horrific period of time in the 1980s, it's like we've gone back in time. It's like a Michael J. Fox movie. You know, we got in our DeLorean and we went too fast and poof, we're back in time. Because once again, we have NATO facing off against a Russian military capability. And now the United States, having withdrawn from the INF Treaty in 2019, is talking about sending intermediate nuclear missiles back to Europe to recreate the exact same situation that we got rid of in the 1980s. And now what's worse is that in the Cold War, it was called a Cold War because we never really got into a shooting match. Today we have a hot war. Today we have an actual large-scale ground combat going on in the largest European country, Ukraine. And it's a war that has already invoked the specter of nuclear weapons, with Russia saying that if NATO interferes, that represents an existential threat, and Russia may have to use nuclear weapons in response. So now NATO, for the first time, is talking about what its nuclear strike policy is. So we have two sides actively preparing for nuclear war as we speak. Ladies and gentlemen, the stakes couldn't get any higher than this. And therefore, you have to ask yourself, why is this happening? Did Russia wake up one morning and say, I want to invade Ukraine? I just want to destabilize the world and go for it. Or has Russia been reacting to the failure of NATO to dissolve itself at the end of the Cold War, and instead expand itself eastward in a manner that Russia viewed as a threat? And this isn't a threat that Russia only recently talked about. We know that Russia has raised the expansion of NATO continuously since the 1990s. The National Security Archives has the audio tapes of the phone calls from President Clinton and then President Yeltsin, where Yeltsin is begging Clinton not to expand NATO. This puts me in a bad light, he said. This is an embarrassment. I lose face with my people. And Clinton said, sorry, we're expanding NATO anyways. Vladimir Putin, when he became president, said, hey, rather than just expanding NATO, why don't you invite me in? And that way we don't have to worry about it. We'll make it one big happy club. And the United States wouldn't do it, because NATO's purpose was to contain Russia, not absorb Russia. This expansion of NATO has been viewed by Russia as a threat. We know this. In 2007, Putin spoke at the Munich Security Conference, gave an outstanding speech, one of the best examples of modern political rhetoric anywhere. I advise everybody to go and watch it. It is a brilliant speech, and he articulates forcefully and eloquently the Russian position. No one can say we don't know what the Russian position was. There it is, spoken by the president himself. One of the things he said is that this expansion of NATO represents an existential threat. It's a red line. How do we know this? William Burns, you might know that name right now. He's currently the director of the CIA. At the time, in 2008, he was the U.S. ambassador to Russia. He wrote a memorandum called "Niet means Niet," no means no, articulating what the Russian position was in regards to NATO expansion. He said it's a red line and the Russians mean it. They view this as an existential threat. If you continue to expand NATO, and here's the important thing, and he wrote this in February 2009, if you continue to push for the expansion of NATO, Russia will have no choice but to invade Ukraine, and Ukraine will lose at a minimum the Crimea and the Donbass. He predicted the future. Maybe that's why he's the director of the CIA today, but he predicted the future accurately. No one can say we didn't know. We knew, and yet we continued to do this. And we pushed Russia into a corner until last December. They said enough is enough. They sent 2 draft treaties demanding a restructuring of the European security framework, and they demand that Ukraine opt out of NATO, become neutral. They said, we're not joking. Take this seriously. If you don't take this seriously, we will have no choice but to undertake what they call the military technical option. They weren't taken seriously. The United States and Europe ignored them, belittled them, mocked them. And now we have what we have, because the Russians don't bluff. That's lesson number 1 out of this whole thing, is the Russians don't bluff. So as you evaluate what's going on, you hear a lot of spin out there about what's happening, the Russian this, Russian that. Take the Russians at face value. When they say they're going to do something, they're going to do something, exactly the way they said they're going to do it. So that's where we are today. We have a major war ongoing in Ukraine, one that, by the way, Russia is winning decisively. I'm not here to promote war. This is an anti-war group, but we're here to talk about the facts. And the fact is, Russia is winning this war decisively. We can go through the metrics all you want. I have a huge amount of experience in this. I've been studying military math all my life. And I'm telling you right now, whatever metric you put up there, Russia has won this war hands down. And they're in the process of, I believe, wrapping up one of the most stunning military victories in modern history. But you won't hear about that because our media is spinning it the exact opposite. And maybe we can talk about why that is at a later date. But that's where we are today. I hope that wasn't too long of an answer.
Great. Thank you very much, Scott. I forgot to mention in Scott's introduction his extensive military career and military experience. And I think we heard some of that just now. My question was going to be about the reasons for war, but you asked a lot of that. You answered a lot of that. We hear on the media here, again, that it was totally unprovoked. We don't hear about the expansion of NATO and the kinds of things that you said. But there's another aspect of it, maybe you could talk about it, is as far as the United States is concerned, the war started in February. But as far as the people of Ukraine are concerned, it started in 2014, and there's been an ongoing war in the Donbass, which thousands of people have been killed. I'm wondering if you would like to mention anything about that, Scott.
Sure. Well, I think I'm a historian by training, so I always go back to the beginning because I don't like to start in the middle of a story because you miss the context. The beginning actually goes back to World War II. Prior to World War II, the Molotov-Ribbentrop German name pact that basically divided Poland up in 1939 between Germany and the Soviet Union. Because of this pact, the way Poland was divided, Eastern Poland became Western Ukraine, and so it was this artificial entity that was lobbed onto Western Ukraine, and the population of Eastern Poland, also it's known in history as Galicia, has been very resentful of the Soviet rule. And when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, they were actually welcomed as liberators by the population of Western Ukraine. Almost overnight, 80,000 of these Western Ukrainian Eastern Poles immediately joined the German military as part of the Waffen-SS. And so they began to express their militancy in the form of one of the most odious Nazi organizations imaginable, the Waffen-SS, the military arm of the Nazi Party, and they fought for the Germans, and they didn't just fight; they murdered. They committed atrocities against the Poles. They committed atrocities against the Russians. They committed atrocities against the Jews. A lot of people will hear of the Babi Yar massacre. Took place in Kiev. Over 30,000 Jews shot down over the course of several days. It may have been directed by the Germans, but the triggermen were Ukrainians. These Western Ukrainians that joined the SS. They had a guy named Stepan Bandera. Stepan Bandera is their leader. He was their leader beforehand. He basically joined the German cause. They'll claim as a Ukrainian nationalist that he joined not because he supported Hitler, but because he was against Stalin. But he wore a German uniform, and his men worked for the Waffen-SS, and they killed Jews. So to me, there's no distinguishing the two. But in 1944, as Germany began to lose the war, the Bandera movement broke away from the Germans. It began an active resistance against the Soviets. We're talking large-scale resistance. To show you how large it was, from 1944 until 1954, this resistance killed over 300,000 Ukrainians lost their lives because of this resistance. 36,000 Soviet security forces and Red Army soldiers lost their lives. This is a major war for going on for a decade. And what makes this major war important is that many of the Ukrainians were controlled by a German intelligence organization, I think it's called the 12th Department, headed by a German general named Galen. When the war ended, the United States, rather than arresting Galen and prosecuting him for war crimes, instead brought in his entire organization, called it the Galen Organization, and subordinated it to the CIA so that it can continue running operations in the Soviet Union. And from 1945 until 1955, the CIA funded this Ukrainian opposition, trained it, sent it weapons, organized it. In 1955, they basically were defeated, but the CIA didn't walk away. From 1955 until 1990, the CIA continued to fund and support and nurture this Bandera movement as part of their propaganda effort. They kept them alive, kept the ideology alive as part of their anti-Soviet activity. This funding only stopped in 1990, but the reason why I bring it up is that when we talk about 2014, we talk about the empowerment of the Bandera movement from a small, right-wing, ideology that had a limited political impact into this major player in Ukraine. And some people say, well, how could you have known? How could you have known this was going to happen? How could you have known the CIA built it, nurtured it, grew it, owned it, controlled it? It wasn't a secret to the United States. So we knew exactly what we were doing when we breathed life into this militant movement in 2014. We supported these color revolutions. 2004, there was a color revolution, the Orange Revolution, that throughout old Soviet rule brought in new quote unquote democracy. There's never been a democracy in Ukraine. Ukraine is one of the most corrupt nations on the planet. Everybody talks about Russian oligarchs. The Ukrainians have more oligarchs per capita than the Russians do, and their oligarchs actually control the politics. How did Zelensky become president? Zelensky was a comedian working for a channel owned by an oligarch who decided, I want to make you president. Zelensky didn't wake up one day and go, I want to be president. He played one on TV, a very popular comedy, I think called Servant of the People. I've watched it. Funny as heck. Really good show. You should watch it. But it's not reality. It's fiction. But it's like if Americans were watching West Wing and decided to elect Martin Sheen as president because he played one on TV. Martin Sheen has no qualification to be president of the United States. But he played one on TV, so we're gonna make him president. Well, that's what the Ukrainians did because the state of their politics is so horrible. But going back to 2014, there was a pro-Russian president named Viktor Yanukovych who was struggling with a major economic problem. The majority of Ukrainians wanted to be aligned with the European Union economically. I think they saw that their future, their best economic future was through Europe, not through Moscow. The problem is the conditions that the European Union were seeking to impose were prohibitive. And it would have required actually Russia to pay for Ukraine to become an EU member. And Putin met with Yanukovych and said, look, I don't care if you join the EU. I'm just not going to pay for it. Russia's not paying for it. So if you want to join, join. But if you can't afford it, then you got to come in and work with me. And so Yanukovych thought about it and said, okay, we can't afford it. I'm going to Russia. Well, the people rose up. There was demonstration street, peaceful demonstrations, by the way, very peaceful demonstrations, the legitimate expression of democracy. I don't think anybody had a problem. Yanukovych didn't have a problem with these demonstrations. He understood where they were coming from. But then what happens is the United States and the European Union come in and say, there's a weakness here. We can solve this problem by orchestrating a coup d'etat that will eliminate Yanukovych, and we can bring in our own people. And these are people that the United States government had identified early on, and we had been training them actively. How do we know this? Because Victoria Nuland, who was the State Department official responsible for that part of the world, has been intercepted with a phone call, a famous phone call where she told the European Union something that we can't say on polite channels, but she also talked about Our boy Yats. Yats, of course, is short for the name of a man who eventually became the prime minister of Ukraine. We handpicked this guy. We handpicked the government. We were talking about Yats competing with Klitschko and all this stuff, and who's going to be the best person. We're making the decisions. And this is a coup d'etat. Now, the peaceful demonstrators can't get rid of Yanukovych. So we brought in the people we know. We brought in the Bandera people. And they came in armed. They seized, they stormed police armories, took weapons, came down, and they overnight, they turned what was a peaceful demonstration in the Maidan Plaza into a violent revolution that killed scores of people. Horrible acts of violence. I mean, again, I don't want to get too political here. We call what happened in January 6th of last year an insurrection, of 2021, I think, an insurrection. You know, the horrific storming of the U.S. Capitol. I condemn it with all my heart. I view that as a gross acts of violence. That's a demonstration gone bad, but it wasn't an insurrection, ladies and gentlemen. An insurrection, they would not have voluntarily left the Capitol. An insurrection would have gone in with guns blazing, killing every member of Congress. That's what an insurrection does. How do we know? Because there was an insurrection in the Maidan in February 2014. That's what an insurrection looks like. It was a U.S. orchestrated insurrection to achieve one purpose, to get rid of Viktor Yanukovych. How do we know that? Because Joe Biden called Viktor Yanukovych in person and said, "You got to go." I don't mean to get angry, but come on, man. What is regime change policy? We've never had regime change policy. Why did Biden get on the phone and tell Yanukovych he has to go? That's regime change policy, literally, writ large, big letters. And he left. But now what happened? You created this mess. You've empowered these Nazis, and they're now in charge. Now, people say, again, but Scott, they're minorities, man. They're just, okay, yeah, they had the violence in the Maidan and all that. But at the end of the day, when they ran for parliament, they didn't get majorities in parliament. Well, you know what? Who else didn't have a majority? The Bolsheviks. You go back and study Russian history, you got these two major elements. You got the Mensheviks, which means small, and the Bolsheviks, which means big. But the Mensheviks are actually big, and the Bolsheviks are actually small. Why did the Bolsheviks win? Because they were violent. They were violent. And so now you've empowered these Bandera-worshiping neo-Nazis to come in and seize power, and they're not going to let it go. They immediately intimidate the Ukrainian Rada to start passing laws that empower nationalism, Ukrainian nationalism, at the expense of Russian-speaking Ukrainians and ethnic Russians. They outlaw the language, they outlaw the culture, and then they violently seek to impose their will. They go down to Odessa, city on the coast. There's a riot there after a soccer game. They throw 150 pro-Russian demonstrators into the House of Culture, then set it on fire. Over 40 people die. The Russians are enraged. The Ukrainians start to make a move towards Crimea, and the Russian government says, not so fast. They send in the little green men, and Russia takes control of Crimea, blocking them. But where do the Nazis go from there? They head straight to the Donbass. They start assaulting the Russian population there. The Russians rose up. They declared independence. A curious fact, Vladimir Putin didn't recognize them as independent states. He rejected that. He said, no, you're part of Ukraine. We have to respect the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine, but we will support you in your effort to defend your rights. And so thus began the Ukrainian civil war in the Donbass, where the Ukrainian army, backed by these neo-Nazi military units, trying to forcefully impose themselves on a Russian population that rejects being manhandled by the Ukrainians. They form independent militias that are supported by the Russians. And now we have a war, a civil war. And it's a horrible war. It breaks down into front lines. And here's the nature of the fighting. Viktor Poroshenko, a president that came in after a series, he's the president before Zelensky, gave a speech. And he says, let me tell you what's going to happen. He's talking to the people of Donbass. Our kids, meaning Ukrainian kids, are going to go to kindergarten. Then they're going to go to the store, and they're going to go to the park, and they're going to have a normal life. Your kids are going to be cowering in the basements while we shell you every single day. You want to know why the Russians are mad? because that's the life that these Russians were subjected to. 14,000 people lost their lives in the course of 8 years, non-stop violence. It could have come to an end. In 2015, something called the Normandy Format, that was the Germans, the French, the Ukrainian government got together with the Russians there as observers, and they agreed to a ceasefire and keeping the Donbass in Ukraine, but that the legislation of Ukraine would pass a series of laws that gave sort of a special autonomous status to the Russians so that they wouldn't be impacted by the anti-Russian laws that had been passed. A very reasonable thing. But when Poroshenko tried to implement it, these neo-Nazis, remember this minority, told him, if you do that, we will kill you. Again, we're talking about what the definition of an insurrection is. Imagine somebody telling Joe Biden, if you sign that legislation, I'm going to kill you. The Secret Service would be all over that person. That would be the last you ever heard of him, rightfully so. But here the Nazi says, you sign it, you die. So guess what happens? He doesn't sign it. Zelensky comes in on a platform of peace, and he wants to implement Minsk. But he was told, not just told, they made a videotape of this where the guy basically says to the videotape, if he signs it, he'll be hanging by the neck until dead on some major Kiev thoroughway. And it's the truth. If Zelensky signed it, he'd be hanging by the neck until dead. Who runs Ukraine? It's not Zelensky. It's not the parliament. It's the Nazis. And if you're a Russian, and I'm going to leave it with this, because this is the emotional part. You thought losing 14,000 people was emotional? I'm going to give you what emotional is. Emotional is losing 23 to 32 million people in a war against Nazi Germany. That is what defines Russia today. Every major town, every major city has a monument to the people who died. Every family lost people, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a dozen, 20 in that war. The biggest holiday in Russia is May 9th. Victory Day. It's not like in America. When was the last time the United States celebrated Victory in Europe Day? Never. Not in our memory. We forgot about it. We don't have any more World War II veterans. They're all dead or dying. But the Russians, they're dead and dying too. You know how they remember it? They formed something called the Immortal Regiment. So the family members of those veterans carry the portraits of the people who fought in that war, and they parade by the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands every May 9th in remembrance of this. It's in their DNA. And now you're asking them to sit back and watch the Nazi ideology come to life in Ukraine and do nothing about it. In America, I'm sick and tired of hearing Americans saying denazification, which is one of the military objectives set forth by Vladimir Putin. It's a myth. It's a joke. It's nothing.
You know,
it's
Scott,
it's as real as it gets, man. It's as real as it gets.
Yeah. You know, Scott, I was in Ukraine a couple of times in the last couple of years. Last time I was there, it was around May 9th. It was on May 2nd to be with the people in Odessa who were the family members of the people that were killed by the Nazis at the House of Trade Unions. And in Ukraine, they stopped celebrating Victory Day. It's no longer celebrated, but it is celebrated by the people. They come out anyway, and they're intimidated by the Nazis when they do, and they continue to come out. And just a couple of other things on what you said. You know, Bandera has been named a hero of the country in Ukraine. That's the status he is right now. And I want to say one other thing about Ukraine. And one of the leaders of the massacre you mentioned in Kiev, where 33,000 Jews were killed while the Nazis was there, was allowed into the United States after World War II. And right up near where I live and near where you live, about an hour south of Albany, he started a camp, which is a summer camp for Ukrainians. And they have statues there of what they call the heroes, including Bandera statues and the other collaborators. And they meet there once a year. They wear the uniforms of the Nazi collaborators of the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, and they celebrate some of these people. So this is going on very seriously there and also here. But I want to get on to more of the military situation that's going on right now, the humanitarian situation, talk about Bucha,
Before
and
we
the
do that,
economic situations. And I'd like to turn it over to Margaret to get into that.
well, actually, there's so much to unpack here. And before
Yeah.
we move on to the humanitarian situation, which is really important, Scott, you've been doing a lot of good writing about the legality of this. And, one of the things that I don't hear mentioned is, leading up to, I mean, Russia started really a massive evacuation of Russian people in the Donbass region on February 18th, as the Ukraine military, the Azov battalion, started escalating their violations of the ceasefire agreement, the Minsk Accord, dramatically. And of course, that's when the Duma, I guess, passed a resolution asking to recognize Donetsk and Lugansk, and then the leaders of those regions are, asking for help. So I think that's something, if you could comment on why it became so critical on February 24th that Russia began this military intervention. But then, as well as that, more on the legitimate security concerns of Russia considering Article 4 of NATO. And so if you could talk about both of those.
Okay, well, let's, again, in World War II, the United Nations was formed, and one of the goals of the UN was to ban war. I think the Nuremberg Military Tribunal had come to an agreement that the greatest war crime of all was a war of aggression, because from the war of aggression, all other war crimes emerge. And so the idea was, how do we stop wars of aggression? They just banned it outright, illegal. There's two exceptions to this. One is a Chapter 7 resolution passed by the Security Council of the United Nations. And that is when the Security Council determines that a situation has occurred that threatens international peace and security and the welfare of nations, that it can authorize UN member nations to use military force to rectify that situation. The most recent example of a Chapter 7 war was Operation Desert Storm back in 1990, 1991. 1991 was Desert Storm, Desert Shield was 1990, in response to Saddam Hussein's invasion and occupation of Kuwait. Again, I'm not here to say good, bad, whatever. I'm just talking about the law right now. And the law said when he invaded Kuwait, the Security Council met and said, we're authorizing the use of military force. And military force was used to achieve the liberation of Kuwait. That is a lawful war. Doesn't make it a just war, doesn't make it a good war, it's just a lawful war. The other way that force is through Article 51. Article 51 allows for legitimate self-defense, either in terms of an individual nation or collective self-defense. And that's an important notion right now, collective self-defense. That's going to come into play. So basically, if you're attacked, you have the inherent right of self-defense. But now we come to one of the questions that emerged, and it actually comes from a period in American history, actually, 1837. There was a U.S. ship called the Caroline operating up by the Canadian border. And the Caroline was providing weapons and manpower, was smuggling weapons and material support to some Canadian rebels that were fighting the British Army. And the British Army knew that the ship was coming in, so the British Army attacked it. So the British Navy attacked the U.S. vessel, which is an act of aggression, unprovoked, they would say. But the British made the claim of the need of preemption based upon the imminent threat posed by the Caroline to the security of the British. So the concept of preemptive self-defense was born. And actually the Caroline affair, the Caroline case, is quoted to this day as one of the bedrock, the legal precedents for the doctrine of preemption. And preemption is basically, if somebody's sitting there, bandaging their fist, getting their fist ready, telling you they're going to punch you, lifting weights, getting that big old arm up, and then they're ready to go, and you say, well, I'm not going to wait and just get punched. I'm going to hit them first. You preempted the attack, and that is legitimate self-defense. If there is a genuine imminent threat that can't be resolved by, for instance, going to the Security Council and asking for help. If you feel that you have to act now and a failure to act now would put you at an existential threat, you can preempt. People have tried to use preemption. The United States tried to use this doctrine of preemption to justify the 2003 invasion of Iraq. It was all a lie. You can't preempt based on a lie. You can't manufacture a case on weapons of mass destruction and the nexus they form with al-Qaeda terrorism when there are no weapons of mass destruction and there is no nexus to al-Qaeda terrorism. So that falls apart. Now we come to Russia. Russia has articulated an Article 51 justification for its action in Ukraine. And they articulate it as a preemptive collective self-defense. Now, how can they do that? First of all, let's understand that Russia has no legal right to intervene in Ukraine if this is an internal Ukrainian dispute, meaning that so long as the Donbass was considered to be part of Ukraine, whatever the Ukrainian government is doing to the Russian speakers of Donbass is not Russia's affair. Russia can't intervene. They have no authority to intervene. They can go to the Security Council and ask for a Chapter 7 resolution to be passed, authorize intervention to resolve this, but they knew that that wasn't going to happen because Ukraine was in bed with the United States and NATO. So this is where something you spoke of is very important. The two oblasts or districts of the Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk, they passed resolutions earlier declaring their independence, but Russia did not recognize their independence. What they did now, or recently, in February of this year, is they petitioned. They passed their own legislation petitioning Russia to recognize them as an independent state. The Russians received that petition, considered that the petition, and then the Russian parliament granted that petition. Why is all this important? That's how constitutionally it has to proceed. So no one can say that this was just made up. No, the laws of the two oblasts, the laws of Russia were preserved. Constitutional due process was seen. It was then presented to Vladimir Putin, who signed the documents recognizing the independent status of Lugansk and Donetsk. Now what has happened overnight? They're no longer an integral part of Ukraine. And so Russia now can say this poses a threat, but then there's another problem. Wait a minute. No one recognizes them but Russia. It's not like the United Nations says, oh, well, Lugansk and Donetsk, you're part of the family. So are they protected by the United Nations Charter if they're not a member? And the answer is no, except here comes the nice little exception here, unless they're part of a collective security arrangement with a UN member. And guess who is a UN member? Russia. So Russia now has a collective security arrangement, another treaty that was signed after the recognition of independence. And this collective security arrangement now allows Russia to intercede on behalf of these security partners and resolve the security situation. Now, this only allows Russia to intervene in the Donbass, if we're talking about the law of war. Russia, however, took a look at the situation and said, well, wait a minute, if we go into the Donbass, the Ukrainians have massed between 60 and 100,000 heavily armed troops in eastern Ukraine. And we have intelligence that they're getting ready to launch an attack into the Donbass to preempt our assistance. So now if we go into the Donbass without dealing with this problem, that creates an existential threat for our security operation. We need to preempt the Ukrainian assault. So now the Russians are using the doctrine of preemption as part of collective self-defense to go after the Ukrainian buildup into eastern Donetsk. But you say, well, wait a minute, Scott, but didn't they also come up from Crimea and come down towards Kiev? How does that fit in? Because now, if you're going after those people, now you have to shape the whole battlefield. And from the Russian perspective, it's not just about the 100,000 troops you're trying to pin down in the Donbass. It's about the 100,000 troops up by Kiev, it's about the 80,000 troops out in western Iraq. It's about the 60,000 troops near Odessa. If you don't do anything about them, they will be able to maneuver in support of the other Ukrainians and defeat the Russian army. So now the Russians have to enlarge the scope of their preemptive attack to pin down these forces. And that's what we saw. When we saw the Russians coming in, it may look like this massive invasion of Ukraine is taking place. But the fact is, all these other things are merely supporting attacks to shape the battlefield so Russia can accomplish the primary mission of destroying 100,000 Ukrainian troops that are positioned opposite the Donbass and liberate the Donbass region. And what I just articulated right now, if I gave this presentation in law school, I would probably get a B+, but it is a cognizable articulation of a legitimate Article 51 claim under collective self-defense. The United States may try to disagree with it, but the problem with that is that the United States was part of a similar Article 51 collective self-defense argument put forward in 1999 when NATO bombed Serbia. It's the exact same thing. It was good for us then. All Russia's done is take that page, make it better, and put it out there. It's the same argument, the same case, and the same legitimacy, even more so because everything Russia has said about the threat from the Ukrainian army is true. Everything the NATO used to justify their preemption, for instance, the concept of the Serbians committing genocide against the Kosovar Albanians, was a lie. Whatever deaths were occurring is because the CIA was working with the Kosovo Liberation Army to create incidents that provoked fighting with the Serbians, which was then called genocide. It's just like the case, remember we talked about the United States invading Iraq, and you can't get legitimacy out of making up a case about WMD. You can't get legitimacy about making up a case about Serbian genocide. Nothing we're talking about with the Russians is made up. The harm that was befalling the people of Donbass, the 14,000 dead, the buildup of Ukrainian military power, all of it is real, and all of it can represent an imminent threat to security that justifies preemptive self-defense and a collective security arrangement.